Hi, everyone. Thank you. Very, very brief comment, which is to say that if you haven't noticed already, if you go out to the foyer during this, if you want to sort of stretch your legs or get some fresh air from the mask, we do have the live feed of what our virtual guests are seeing in screens in the foyer out there. If folks want to sort of escape the room for a little minute, that's a possibility. With that said, I do want to just sort of welcome the next panel today, which is Decoupling Social Justice from Green Dogma. So please join me in welcoming our next panel.
That is bright. Hi, everybody. I think I speak on behalf of most of us in saying that it's so great to be here with all of you. I really missed, I think I call it Nerd Christmas. I really missed last year. And it truly is my most favorite time of the year. And so it's lovely to get to be gathering together in person, which safety procedures in place. My name is Jennifer Bernstein. I'm a lecturer at the University of Southern California in the Spatial Sciences Institute. And one of the great and terrifying things about Breakthrough is, everyone you turn to and speak with, you feel completely out of your league. So that's definitely consistent with this panel. I'm honored to be hosting it, and I look forward to what I think is going to be an exciting discussion. So I'd also like to say welcome to our virtual participants. We are really happy you're here. I was just telling Omar that, when I had little kids, I missed 5 years of conferences. And I think that this format so far is working lovely and hopefully can increase the accessibility of events like this to folks in situations where they can't travel physically. So this is exciting, and I hope it becomes more the norm. And good job, team, for making things go so smoothly so far. So I'm doing a little introduction, and I'm not quite sure that the story I'm going to tell is entirely relevant to this panel, but I think it's relevant to sort of these broader questions we ask ourselves as environmentalists. So the other day, you know how the Tupperware cupboard gets, somehow, it's like the socks where you've got just 12 different socks and you don't know where the others are, and that's like it is with the Tupperware and the lids. So I swung by the dollar store to get some more Tupperware. And my mom, concerned about my daughter's health, she says, well, make sure it's BPA free. And I'm saying, okay, I'll do my best. And then I'm feeling guilty for buying plastic in the first place. The whole plastic process is toxic, but I say, all right, I'm just gonna do it. And I went to the dollar store and got my Tupperware. And as it's going through the conveyor belt, the cashier said, oh man, I can't wait to get my paycheck so that I can buy Tupperware too. And it just kind of stuck with me, that this woman is waiting for her paycheck to buy Tupperware at the dollar store where she works that costs $1. And once again, as an environmentalist, I realized that my concerns were so different than so many other people in the world. And it's just been one of these things that's stuck with me since it happened. So to this panel. 1970s era environmentalism is often characterized as being sort of relatively ignorant of urban issues and the needs of disadvantaged populations. And sort of this strain of environmentalism, with its focus on the value of nature for its own sake, biodiversity, has been challenged by many people in this room, myself included, for not looking at the needs of populations, people of color, women, other minorities, and we've done that pretty good, I think, at Breakthrough, is talking about the failures of contemporary environmentalism. And in the 1990s, Robert Bullard, recognized the needs for environmentalism to address the needs and desires of other communities between, beyond sort of the old constituencies. And a lot of this environmental justice movement, I think, has been very successful, although certain aspects have also been considered to be instrumentalist and paternalistic. But I think one of the things we're going to talk about today, I hope, is whether or not ecomodernism is doing better. Many who profess to be ecomodernists or ecomodernish say the YIMBY movement and a lot of the nuclear movement tends to skew white, male, advantaged, and educated. So today, do people who profess to represent underrepresented communities actually represent them? How do the so-called environmental decisions from either traditional environmentalism or ecomodernism with respect to housing, transportation, and energy benefit and burden different groups differently? And how do we achieve our environmental goals equitably? Another thing that I think we need to think about is the way in which ecomodernism is explicitly global in scope and pro-technological. And I think it's worth considering, as these technologies have been rolled out, how have they historically affected disenfranchised communities? So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Omar Wasso, who is an assistant professor at Pomona College in the Department of Politics, and he looks at race, politics, and statistical methods.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to present here today. I'm new to BTI, but have been kind of an admirer of BTI from afar, and so it's a real privilege to be in the room. I wanted to begin, because we're in the Bay Area, thinking about Sheila James. So this is from an article in the New York Times written by Connor Doherty. And Sheila begins her commute at 2 a.m. Sorry, she wakes up at 2:15 a.m. to begin a 2.5-hour commute from Stockton to her job in San Francisco. Right? She used to live 15 miles from work in Alameda, right? But 3 years ago, in this article, after a developer bought her building and evicted Ms. James and her neighbors, she moved to Stockton. It's going to be a little hard to see on this map, but the first dot in the upper, or sort of mid-right there, is Stockton, and Ms. James takes a train for an hour from Stockton to Pleasanton, and that's the second dot, and then there's a bus from Pleasanton to BART in the Lower Bay, and then BART up to San Francisco to begin her job. So, is that, how representative is that? Well, California is in this kind of remarkable state of being this engine of wealth creation, sort of remarkable in the history of the world, and at the same time has the nation's highest poverty rate when we account for housing, energy, transportation, and for those of you from California or who follow housing issues, none of this will be new. But I think it's worth thinking about the kind of remarkable contrast we have of just unprecedented wealth creation combined with this immiserating impoverishment of a large swath of this state, right? I mean, I'm now living outside of Los Angeles, and just, it has developing world qualities of, shanty towns next to the major downtown skyscrapers, right? So how did we get here? There are, of course, many factors that contribute to this moment, but I want to focus on one in particular, one that I just am kind of obsessed with, not alone in that, but it's zoning. Again, this is going to be a little hard to read, so let me try to talk you through what's going on here. So let me begin by giving credit to Greg Morrow. This is perhaps the most successful dissertation figure that anyone, at least in housing, that anyone or urban planning has published. And so what you're looking at on the x-axis is time from 1960 to 2030. On the y-axis is the zoned kind of allowable housing capacity of Los Angeles. And what you see is that in 1960, it was legal to build housing to support 10 million people. And that between 1960 and 1980, it was downzoned such that 60% of that legal capacity was eliminated. And I think it's important to note that like part of what's going on in California in that moment is a push for fair housing laws that allow, that basically make it illegal to engage in housing discrimination, right? So at the same time that there is this kind of push for greater access for, in particular, black people to housing, but also things like public housing, there's this massive kind of regulatory push to kind of, in some ways, counter that. It's not the only thing going on, but race is clearly central to that story. And so if you want to understand some of what produces Sheila James having to move to Stockton, you have to understand this process of kind of regulatory moats being enacted to prevent people from moving to opportunity. So, and how does this relate to environmentalism? Well, clearly things like long commutes are environmentally bad, but it's actually even more profound than that. This is from the Sierra Club, San Francisco Sierra Club, one of the primary advocates of certain kinds of anti-development policy, doing some kind of self-reflection. The developer behind the first single-family zoning district in America was a Sierra Club San Francisco Bay Chapter member who served twice as Sierra Club president, Duncan McDuffie, a home builder from Berkeley, responsible for some of the city's most luxurious neighborhoods. McDuffie placed racial covenants, this is to say you cannot sell to somebody non-white, racial covenants on the deeds of the homes he built. He also supported segregation in the area around his developments through novel zoning, things again like single-family zoning, preventing apartment buildings from being developed in order to enhance the value of his subdivisions. You restrict supply, classic kind of economic story, you can, and if demand continues to increase, prices go up, right? So, and it's you know, and it wasn't just this one individual, right? There's a coalition of folks, boosters of Berkeley's single-family zoning ordinance, such as the California Real Estate Magazine, publicly bragged that it would create an entire neighborhood that would remain reliably free of Negroes and Asiatics. What was notable about the 1916, right, over 100 years ago, ordinance was not merely that it was racist, but that the ordinance itself could effectively segregate without any explicit references to race. So, and this is what we've seen now for more than a century is exclusionary zoning, economic zoning, where I taught at Princeton up until this year, right? I'm on a lot that is a 1.5 acre, that's actually a 2-acre lot, but you can't build you need 1.5 acres to put a structure up. So on our 2-acre lot, we're allowed one house, and so the way I think about what's going on, right, we're next to a very liberal church that has we love our Muslim neighbors, and I think we love our Muslim neighbors and Black Lives Matter as long as you're a millionaire. And that's kind of sort of where we are in a lot of what is a legacy of contemporary environmentalism, right, is that it has been weaponized to maintain exclusionary neighborhoods, exclude people from opportunity, right, in ways that are profoundly, again, immiserating. So decoupling as a phrase is often meant to sort of say, how can we create human flourishing that is uncoupled from environmental degradation? And I want to kind of consider, and I'm at time, so I'll save kind of some of my thoughts on this. But I want to ask, how can we decouple environmental progress from human degradation? So that's, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. Great way to get started. Now I'd like to introduce Julian Brave Noisecat. I read your bio online multiple times, and I can't figure out what you don't do. Julian describes himself as working at the intersection of policy, journalism, art, and activism, and he's also the Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Data for Progress.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to Breakthrough for having me. My people would say in our language, "Chochwinuch," which doesn't actually mean good morning. It means you all survived the night, or you made it through the night. I called my grandmother the other day, and I said, "Chochwinuch," and she said, "Oh, just barely." And I wanted to start with, or I usually start with something in my people's language, because I think it's important, especially in a context where we are challenging so much of what came before effectively in the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement, to also honor and recognize what came before. And so as we're standing here in Sausalito, I think that it's really important to acknowledge that if we passed through San Francisco, we were passing through what the Ohlone people there called Yalamu. They had their villages there, and they actually fled across the Golden Gate when the missions were first established. Many of them fled across the Golden Gate and ended up around here. Not far from here, there's a place called China Camp, where a number of their shell mounds are still there. They show a mixed Coast Miwok, Ohlone, and Pomo, and even Christian and Catholic influence there. And they're still here. Just in this area, there's the Grattan Valley Rancheria, people who fought for federal recognition for many, many decades. They were the proud people of one of the most noted basket makers ever in California Indian and all of human history. Her name was Mabel McKay, and the baskets would come to her in her dreams, and she would say that they were living and that they had a spirit, and that you couldn't learn basket making, you could only dream it, which I think is really powerful. Just out in the water, when you guys, if you walk out to the bay here, you can see another indigenous dream that was really important to honor, and that's the Alcatraz Island, which in 1969 was the site of an occupation by a group of Native students and urban activists that essentially kickstarted the current era of indigenous rights here in the United States and in some ways actually beyond. And as we're, I think, going to have a hard conversation about the shortcomings of environmentalism, places where environmental justice and climate justice are running into walls effectively, or moats, maybe as Omar put it, I think that it's really important to also acknowledge that there was a lot of fight that came before, and that it was really important, and that we are not here to look down upon the people who have brought us to this moment. With that, I guess I'll sort of explain how I'm approaching this. My quick comments. I probably wear too many hats. One of them is as a writer, and one version of the talk that I would have given today would have probably been about the current ecological apocalypse that we are facing, and how indigenous peoples as post-apocalyptic peoples have unique human experiences and forms of traditional and environmental knowledge that might actually lend important wisdom to that challenge. You're not going to get that talk today, though. You're going to have to buy my book or read my articles to get that one. Instead, I'm going to put on my strategist hat. As was mentioned, I helped start a think tank called Data for Progress, where we work a lot on climate and environmental issues. And in that role, I had the incredible honor and opportunity to be the first to suggest that Deb Holland would be a kick-ass Secretary of the Interior, and working with a bunch of tribal leaders, indigenous women, environmentalists, progressives, actually even a few congressional Republicans. We led an inside-outside sort of guerrilla campaign to make her the first ever Native American cabinet secretary, and I'm very proud of that, and I think that she's going to do a wonderful, wonderful job. And so as someone who tries to observe things, put them into words, and then also sometimes strategizes them, I guess I'm going to use the remaining 3 minutes, if I can fit this into 3 minutes, to talk about what I see in the landscape of environmental issues and justice issues and climate. And I'm going to break this into sort of two ways of looking at the challenge. I think one way of looking at the challenge is through the lens of popular opinion and how these issues might play out in a democracy where everyone has a vote, and that vote matters and counts. And from a certain framing, environmental justice should be among actually the most popular issues in American politics. Consistently, if you look at polls, we look at a lot of polls and field a lot of polls at Data for Progress, you'll see that issues related to clean air, clean water, and the infrastructure and regulations to support those are among basically the most popular issues that any American politician could be running on. So there's this curious thing where these issues, which should be, they're 70, 80% issues depending on the poll you're looking at, which even when you're up against, the corporate barrage that would be thrown against any sort of legislative or ballot measure campaign against, advocacy or something to get policy done on that front, it's the kind of issue that you would expect could, because of how popular it is, withstand that. And yet, we are now today actually in DC witnessing a infrastructure deal, bipartisan infrastructure deal, where it appears that we may not actually make that layup, that we may not actually fund the water infrastructure that we need to the dollar figure that we need to actually replace all the lead pipes in this country. And so you have this very fascinating paradox in my mind, where you have this issue that should be a slam dunk winning issue, and we're not making the slam dunk. And so I think that that's curious. On the other end, you have the coalition politics of justice and environment issues. And I apologize already to my other panelists, because I see I'm going to go a little over here. And here is, I think, the dominant frame in which we see environmental and climate justice issues intervening, at least when it comes to Democratic Party politics. What you often see are communities of color highlighting issues of environmental racism, of unfair and unjust siting of pipelines, for example, and highlighting that issue of environmental injustice to drive a wedge in the Democratic Party's coalition and to force liberal politicians to take a side. And you see this on issues like pipelines, where the Democratic Party has to choose between the workers and their unions that build the pipelines and the communities of color that are often in their path. It's often a very tough choice for Democrats. And you're also increasingly seeing this with other environmental and infrastructure issues. I'll rattle off a few. You have CCS, you have direct air capture and carbon removal technologies, you have nuclear energy, and as a complete aside, Alex Trembeth was having a very exuberant conversation about nuclear energy last night, and he got some wine on my vans. I think that's important because it highlights where we are, which is the breakthrough dialogue, and that's maybe the only place where something like that could happen. You have it with respect to mining issues, where you have indigenous communities in many instances, opposed to mining in places where we are going to try to get minerals to build the batteries and the renewable energy infrastructure, et cetera. And we're starting to see it now with transmission lines as well. And I think here it's really important to emphasize that the purposeful strategy, as I see it, is for those communities of color, to highlight the white supremacist, I think it's fair to call it that after what Omar just shared, legacies within the environmental movement, and also to directly take on industries that also happen to include a lot of workers that since the New Deal were core to the Democratic Party's coalition. And so essentially, I think from a 30,000-foot view, you have kind of two potential paths forward on justice and environmental and climate issues. You have the path forward where you try to win the coalition politics by highlighting issues of environmental racism and trying to get as many liberals to take the side of activists and communities of color as possible. But you, I think, also have this less explored path, which would be to electoralize the issues, to be ruthless in the message testing, to be very strategic in trying to convince as many moderates and perhaps even conservatives that clean air and clean water issues are ones that they can get behind, ones that Democrats who maybe need to win in places that are R+5, R+23, like the state of West Virginia, can get behind those issues. And I see that as a much less traveled road. And I guess what I want to end with suggesting is that, and I guess maybe some folks are wondering, why does this guy who has a byline in Jacobin and Dissent and The Nation, all these things, say that we should start trying to persuade moderates and conservatives? And I think if I was just 2 years younger, 3 years younger, and sitting in the audience, I'd be wondering the same thing. I'd be like, man, this guy's a sellout hack. Like, he wants to go to the rest of the country and try to figure out how to get the folks who are not like us to come around to our thing. And I think the last thing I want to say then is that in the sort of push to get Deb Haaland to be the first Native American cabinet secretary, the secret sauce was not the wonderful story about her going to the camps in the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline and cooking green chili stew and tortillas for the water protectors, even though that is a beautiful and wonderful story. The secret sauce was that Don Young, a congressional Republican from Alaska, Tom Cole, a Republican from Oklahoma, and eventually Lisa Murkowski, a Republican from Alaska, who's only just one of 2 senators to ever win a write-in campaign. The other one was Strom Thurmond, of all people. And she did it because of Alaska Native voters. The secret sauce was figuring out how to position this very progressive, very historic figure for environmental justice as someone who people who are very different from me, someone who grew up in Oakland, California, could get behind and could support. And that took a bit of creativity and thinking outside of the box and how we advocated for her. And so while I think that, I wish that this was not the way that our democracy works, it is the way our democracy works. And I think that there could be a path forward on issues of justice, environmentalism, et cetera, that digs into, what are the creative and new ways to approach these issues that are persuasive to, in many instances, the folks who have actually perpetrated the environmental racism against people of color, indigenous people, working class people. And with that, I've went way over, so I'm super sorry to the rest of my panelists, but I'm very excited for this conversation. Kuksjem, chuk, thank you.
Julian, I'm dying to ask you more about the indigenous communities as post-apocalyptic, but I'm going to respect your wishes, and buy your book. Now I'd like to introduce Jennifer Hernandez. She's a partner at Holland & Knight, also a Breakthrough Institute board member. She's practiced land use and environmental law for more than 30 years. And she also has a very provocative article in this issue of the Breakthrough Journal that gave me that really good kind of discomfort when I read it. And I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about it. So hopefully we have time later to hear more about that. And so thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. So first of all, I'm just so honored to be here. I had the best breakfast conversation I'd had since I got married a while back, 30 years plus. And learned about atomic energy, nuclear energy. It is so refreshing both to be out of our COVID closets and also with people who come to this with the idea of pragmatic progress. We don't have to give it up, right? There's plenty to do to make things better for everyone. And that's just such a lovely alternative to the chattering folks on TV. I do have a provocative topic. I need to just tell you a couple things. I grew up in Pittsburgh, California, without the H. It was an industrial factory town, John Mansville, Union Carbide, Dow Chemical, U.S. Steel, where my dad and both grandfathers worked. It was highly polluted when I grew up. I went astonishingly, having never been out of California, to Harvard undergrad and started as a freshman, and it was wild and crazy and bizarre. And then I came back and went to Stanford Law School in really what, for this country, I think is about the golden lottery ticket, right? That's a launch. And I left and started and learned environmental law with the idea that I'd start at a firm, get trained, and then move into advocacy work against pollution. And in March of my first year as a lawyer, my dad, like all of his peers, were permanently laid off from their only job, union job at U.S. Steel, which had provided what we thought of as a middle-class background. You know, we went to Catholic schools, my brother, sister, and I, $17 a month for all three of us as tuition, owned a small home, had medical coverage, paid vacation. We were living in clover. And dropping to a non-union job and a minimum wage clerk position at a hardware store was a pretty hard thing. And it made me rethink a lot about the privilege that I'd experienced, first in college and then in law school and now in the private sector. And I stayed in the private sector for lots of reasons, but what I've done for 37 years was get permits for anybody trying to build something in California, whether they're public agencies trying to complete a park renovation or affordable housing or church groups trying to make a senior housing project. It's a blood sport. And that blood sport, when you charge by the hour, is a lucrative practice, which itself is sort of obscene. But I want to give you some sense of what that level of expertise has told me about California race and climate policy. I'll come back to the title, which is absolutely provocative. So I'm going to do housing, transportation, and energy. I'm going to start with what our doctrine is. Our climate doctrine on housing is that we have about 3 million fewer homes than we need, and we should put that new housing in higher density, existing city neighborhoods that are transit dependent so people can ride the bus. That's the climate housing solution. Sounds good? Sounds familiar? That form of housing is the most expensive housing we can buy outside the luxury market. That little table on the right is a cost table, a small single-family home, what we would think of as a starter home. Assume that costs about $1, which in actual dollars is about $225,000 or so to build today in non-California land, and I'll get back to that. Here it's a lot more. But if you just think of that as one, you go up a little bit higher, smaller lots, you have to spend a little more because it's more expensive to build kind of tight, compact spaces. Townhomes are a little more expensive beyond that. Then you get into mid-rise and high-rise buildings can cost 5 to 7 times more per square foot to build. And what does that mean? Well, it kind of means you need to pay $3,500 to $5,000 a month rents for the new high-density housing template that California is so embracing. And that's quite a bit more. We have actually a pretty high statewide median income of almost $100,000. Of course, it's lower for Latinos, African American, some API folks, indigenous folks. But even a $100,000 household stretched should be able to rent a place for $27 or so $100 a month. The form of housing we are building, which cannot start being built unless there are enough renters in the market to pay those high rents, is inherently unaffordable. It's inherently unaffordable. It also has other consequences. It's never for sale, except past $1 million price point, not to speak of the fees. Homeownership has really been the absolute most successful pathway into the middle class for all of America. And of course, homeownership was something that was denied through redlining and other practices to minority Californians for decades. This form of housing is antithetical to home ownership. So who said we needed to end home ownership to solve global climate change? And then there's the whole notion that we should stop riding cars. I mean, you know, getting rid of cars has been a long desired goal of many in the environmental movement. We actually got rid of a lot of pollution from cars, like 99% of the smog-forming pollution was out of the fleets as by the end of the Obama administration compared to 1972. But when you say you can't move you should really just use the bus and stop using a car. What you end up with is what one of my clients called the most racist housing plan in a century. This is a Long Beach plan that is designed around reducing vehicle miles traveled through the siting of new homes in high-density, transit-served neighborhoods. Those are the green neighborhoods on the left side. Let's see if I can get this working. Yeah. So transit, poor, minority. This is where homes should be built. Red are areas where homes should not be built. These are actually racially covenanted single-family homes, primarily developed during the aerospace explosion for white-only families. These neighborhoods to this day have much higher incomes, median incomes, and much, much higher white populations. This low VMT, vehicle mile travel regime, says we should put housing where there are already poor people who frankly couldn't fight transit. And that has resulted in a remarkable displacement pattern I'll tell you about in a second. I did, though, want to just highlight home ownership for a minute. So this is the city of Ontario, one of the few cities in California that is actually embracing a fair amount of growth. The southern part of the city, just south of the major airport, and this is an employment hub, by the way. This is the area where, southern part of the city is the area where home ownership continues to be affordable. It was long planned, it was partly built. It was slated for destruction by this same land use plan that was focused on reducing VMT. Instead, new housing should have gone in the green areas, which are already fully built out and much poorer. But what's interesting about this is the majority of the home buyers in the southern part of Ontario are Latino and other minority families. So this regime of reducing vehicle miles traveled so people can ride the bus, who's being hurt? It's families who can still afford to buy the very few locations relatively close to urban job centers where housing can be acquired at around a $500,000 price point. What has this resulted in? This is kind of similar to the Omar slide. The purple areas are very, very hard to see. Oops. Purple areas are very, very hard to see, but you can see them sort of in Oakland and San Francisco or whatever. Those are historically black communities that have lost massive population. The green areas are where black communities have moved. And of course, they've moved as well to outside the region entirely, including Stockton in the story Omar told from Connor. This exurban movement, which is actually where I grew up, is routinely decried as sprawl. Well, where are people supposed to live? They have been pushed out by kind of an environmental ethic that says the view from my sidewalk is part of my environment. And what I get to protect now is my environment. This displacement picture and this emphasis on VMT reduction, reducing vehicle miles traveled through housing in Oakland, shows a pretty clear alignment. So the areas of Oakland designated for the highest amount of growth correspond pretty well as a dark green to the areas that were redlined, minority-majority neighborhoods back in the early part of the last century. And the areas where only white people were allowed are those where we don't want new housing. Is this a coincidence? Or is it really just this absolutely blind bias, prejudice, racism against those people? I was mentioning to one of our conference attendees that this town, Sausalito, was busted for intentionally segregating by race its two elementary schools last year. This isn't a yesterday or a last century. This is a today and an ongoing, I'm not a NIMBY, I just want to protect the character of my neighborhood. It's my environment. Transportation. So let's get people out of cars. It's a justice issue. Well, actually, it's kind of an injustice issue if you look at the data. Very, very, very unpopular data. We've lost, even pre-COVID, nationally, public transit fixed route ridership has dropped tremendously, especially in buses. UCLA did a great study. Who's no longer riding the bus? Low-income workers. Low-income workers of color are no longer riding the bus. Would you ride the bus? If you had a choice whether to buy a $3,000 Honda or a Toyota that you can't kill, and you could get your kids to work and your mom to the doctor and do the shift work and the work in the off downtown locations where people not in the keyboard economy have to show up to be paid, of course you need a car. You need a car so much in California, we legalized driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. And now we're going to take cars away, or we're going to add to the price of each house a VMT surcharge. And when I say house, I'm talking about apartments, condos, whatever, duplexes, townhomes. I'm not talking about a single family sprawling Levittown story here. I'm talking about housing. But part of our new California regime is to charge new housing that is located in suburban scale neighborhoods, all those little exclusionary white neighborhoods, fees of $50,000 to $600,000 per unit. Because, gosh, they're living in an area that's car dependent, and we hate that, even for electric vehicles. Lots of studies, end of welfare to work, we ended up showing that families that had a private vehicle had better educational outcomes, stayed on jobs better, higher income. I'm just going to finally finish that, we're now well on our way to the highest energy costs in the nation. And that's only going to accelerate. This ecomodernism and environmental justice topic, and I really, really celebrate the Breakthrough Institute for making this a thoughtful discussion as opposed to, we need to fill out our quota on the board. Environmental justice is incredibly important to prevent disparate impacts, disparate risks. It's just a slice of the civil rights pie. And whether you believe in civil rights as kind of a Catholic in remission, or the morality of giving everyone an equal shot at success. The truth is that morality, that upward mobility, that prosperity is going to be much, much better for climate and the environment than this kind of warring factionalism of skip natural gas, buy an electric gizmo, and hope it works. And I don't disparage electric gizmos, I just know people who try to make them work. And I'll just close with saying is, we had a whole bunch of blackouts last year, we had some already this year. Marin, which is our whitest, wealthiest county, reacted with horror at the idea of multiple days without electricity. The kids, my God, you unplug them for 3 hours and they're going crazy without their phones because I never charge them on time, or at least that's true with my son. Anyway, so what we did was have a whole bunch of people run off and buy Tesla wall batteries and microgrids, and how fantastic if you're wealthy enough to live in Marin, own your own home, and have enough spare change to sink $30,000 into your own little power plant. Great, you'll have lights. Your neighbors won't. Do you think that's going to be a better, safer, more equitable space on Earth? No. So I just think we can step back and kind of integrate in real climate policy such that California, counting people who move to Texas where their per capita greenhouse gas emissions almost triple, that for us in California is measured as a climate change benefit. We reduce GHG in California and we don't care that it increases by more than the reduction just by displacing people, especially those people, to other states. I don't think this is complicated. I think this group has more than enough expertise, and I for sure urge you to just think hard about transparent metrics, and I'll talk about that a little more when we get to it. Thank you.
Okay, where are we with time? 30 minutes? I don't have a watch. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was as provocative as I imagined it to be. So I have a few questions, but I really do think that this audience has a lot of great ones too. So I'm going to keep sort of my part relatively short. So I've done some research on solar development in the Mojave, and there's a great term that Dustin Mulvaney coined called the green halo. And it's the way in which this sort of unquestioning approval of, solar equals good has basically absolved a lot of developers from asking these hard questions about, the agency people have over the spaces they occupy, a lot of the issues with solar commodity chains. And I think, Jennifer, you especially talked a lot about the ways in which there is a lot of intentionality behind these programs. At the same time, I'm wondering if, and this I guess is for everyone, the way in which this idea of a green halo, this unquestioning green equals good, has both gotten in the way of progress, but also perhaps, cluelessness can be better than intentionality. So I'm just wondering if that's something that you've seen in work you've been involved with.
Well, in the housing, transportation, energy pricing space, this is fully intentional. There was no accident that solar roofs and EVs are a subsidy program that benefits wealthy donors. On the green energy side, so the best solution, and even it seems pretty skeptical in terms of whether they got it right, is to convert about 1.3 million acres of California into solar and wind to achieve our high electricity scenario. Our entire urbanized footprint, which includes all little towns plus all metro areas, is about 5.4 million acres. So we're going to add 1.3 million acres. We fight for 25 years with 30 lawsuits over the redevelopment of a site in Los Angeles with endless lawsuits. So it's a laughable concept that California is going to scale up to anything like the level of wind and solar and battery that scenario calls for. We'll buy it from other states who will then use coal.
I want to pick up on the idea of cluelessness as a sort of as a provocative way of thinking about this. So I grew up in New York City, and if we think about Sheila James again, right? Like, what are some of the things, the technologies that might have been sort of transformative in her life? And it's things like, I take your point about apartment buildings are more expensive, but it's like 100 years ago, we were able to put, 6, 10-story buildings up. We had this remarkable technology called an elevator that allowed us to, on relatively compact pieces of land, house a lot of people. We had technologies like the train that made it possible to have 8 million people live, not 100 years ago, but to scale up a city and have it, have low emissions and lots of, affordable transportation. Trains have been around for 150 plus years. And so I kind of want to take Ted's toast last night, right? We're going to think about, we're going to toast the techno fixes. And I want to kind of flip that for a second and say, actually, much of the technology we need is sort of archaic. We don't need ecomodernism. We need eco-industrialism or something, right? We need, safe nuclear power that we've, it's like that's been done in France, in 13 years, 50 years ago, right? Massive deployment. Again, things like being able to create high-density housing, that's not some miracle that innovation we need, right? And so what is the technology that is preventing us in some ways from producing what we did 100 years ago? And I think it's this particularly difficult conversation in conversation with the prior panel. It's the law, right? We have produced a regulatory framework that makes things like elevators, makes a third story in much of Los Angeles illegal, right? And so we've got, part of what I think was interesting in the prior panel was there's this sense, which I agree with fully, like the most important technology in the sense of like a human innovation that produces flourishing is a functioning state, is governance. But it might be that there's a kind of curve where at the low end you have too little state. And in a place like California, we've now produced so much state capacity that as one political scientist puts it, right, we've got a vetocracy. Everybody with a lawsuit or with a community review board or can prevent progress. So coming back to the question about cluelessness, I think it's sort of interesting to think that like maybe there was a kind of sweet spot in terms of development and kind of engines of economic opportunity in allowing poor people to move to cities where there were jobs, which existed in an era where we had, it looks a little bit more like, in terms of housing, the kind of housing development we saw in a place like New York, than it does now in a very progressive, but nevertheless like incredibly restrictive housing or legal regime in a place like California. So just to kind of say that a little bit more simply and to wrap, right? It's like the state is our biggest lever. The state is the thing that can produce the most human flourishing. It also is deployed again and again and again as a tool for those with power and wealth to kind of hold on to their power and wealth and extend it. And so that's this like really difficult tension. We don't need to use the state as the biggest lever we've got, and we also need to be incredibly sensitive to the fact that routinely those efforts boomerang back, and that's an exceedingly difficult Gordian knot to untie.
Any thoughts? I actually have a question for you, Julian. So you talked about these two approaches, and the second one, which you identified as the less explored path, and I think you said ruthless message testing. And it reminded me of before Breakthrough, I worked with Ted we had a political strategy firm called American Environics, and the idea was to look at people's psychographics and try to do political strategy based on a deeper set of values, these bridge values that we found. Identify these groups that shared some values with our base and reach out to them and do this messaging. And this was during the George Lakoff era. Don't think of an elephant. And we did it, and in a lot of cases we were successful, but I think that we were I think we realized that it was a lot harder than we thought it was gonna be. And I think with this, I think it's gotten immensely harder with this idea of confirmation bias, where it's a lot easier to reject something that you don't agree with than it is to truly be swayed. And I was thinking about this recently in terms of vaccines, and I was like, we just need to market them in terms of American freedom, because you have freedom to do what you want to do, and let's really tap into this. And I talked to a friend of mine who does PR, and he was like, yeah, it's harder than that. So I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit about message testing and sort of some of the challenges and complexities that come when we sort of treat really deeply held values with a not sufficiently nuanced approach.
Just so I understand the question is how can message testing help break through sort of values that are so deeply seated that any message couldn't persuade them? Is that essentially what you're getting at?
That's a more concise way of saying it, yeah.
They pay me for words once in a while. I've also been sitting with the last conversation because I wrote a story about the Moms for Housing movement for California Sunday Magazine a little over a year and a half ago. And what's interesting to me is that there's a whole other set of critiques that some of which slot into what you were talking about displacement and the development that's happening not actually serving the people for whom it should be serving, right? And then there's a whole other set of critiques about the transformation of housing into a financial asset, and they were very explicitly about sort of decommodification politics and stuff like that. And I guess what I'm trying to sort of think through is like, where are the points of tension? There's a lot of them clearly, and then where are the points of alignment between these various sort of, you know, influencers and players in the world of California housing politics? Because it does seem like like everyone's at loggerheads from my perspective, and it seems like a logjam that's not getting unstuck in a lot of ways. But there's probably someone clever who could figure out how to get it unstuck, or a group of people who are clever to figure out how to get unstuck. To your question about message testing, I think that, look, I think that there is reason now, I think, to be skeptical of, firstly, the not accuracy of our polls, but the notion that the people who we are even getting to respond to these surveys being a representative sample of the rest of the country. Trump convinced his people that the polls were fake, so they stopped responding to them, and that is now a significant challenge. And then I think the other side of that is, you know, how many people out there are there really who can be persuaded on a number of these issues? You know, after masks became a culture war issue, I think it's reasonable to ask, you know, who is the persuadable group out there? But I think that they do exist, and I think that if you think about it as a game that needs to be won, right? Like, it is illogical not to select what we know to be, with a good degree of certainty, the most effective combination of policies and messages to win the most number of people over, or to win the people who we need to win over. And I think my central critique of my particular ideological camp, which is the progressive camp, is that we are very bad at optimizing in that kind of a way. We talk as though we are often talking to other activists and other progressives, and to folks who, you know, went to college and understand sort of these ideological theories and things like that. And that is not the way, I think, to win the most number of people, or the way to win the votes of legislators who are closest to the deciding votes, even in places like California, where Democrats are the ruling party. And so, you know, I don't want to overstate the power of that stuff. And at the end of the day, it's not thrilling to say that the politicians should just do the poll-tested thing, because, of course, they already do that most of the time. But I do think that there are ways in which, you know, especially for issues where you're going to really have to push and fight, that set of tools really does, in fact, add to the toolbox of folks on the left who want to see progressive change happen.
Mm-hmm.
I want to pick up on a key point that I think you made, right? So my primary research is on protest movements, particularly in the 1960s. And, you know, I think I am often deeply pessimistic about politics in California, politics in America, and I have to remind myself that people were up against much worse odds, you know, in the early 1960s, looking at this incredibly durable system of Jim Crow segregation, and yet took it on and dismantled it, right? And so in my moments of despair or pessimism, I sort of like, in some ways I don't have the luxury of that, right? I have to kind of learn this lesson from the people who fought before me. And so some of those lessons are echoing what was just said, is right, is that like politics is fundamentally coalitional, and the trick is to think about how to build winning coalitions, even when you might be a despised statistical minority, as African Americans were in the 1960s, as people with AIDS were in the 1980s, as we've seen again and again, groups have been able to kind of capture a moral high ground to build winning coalitions, right? So around housing, one small example, and I don't, this is not a case I know in much detail, but I think there's an interesting example in Minneapolis where they built a coalition to upzone the city, which is to say, to allow for more housing development, not a silver bullet, not not going to solve everything, but in a world where home voters, right, people who are homeowners, who are loud, who kind of block progress, have been able to kind of exert incredible amounts of kind of veto power around the country, they were able to build a coalition that was racial justice advocates who were able to say, this city is profoundly shaped, as we just saw earlier, by the legacy of racial covenants, of segregation, of redlining. And if we're going to, as people who think of ourselves as kind of liberal folk, take any kind of regard for that history, we need to incorporate that into how we think about contemporary policy. Environmental justice advocates who were enthusiastic, and again, I think these are complicated points, but for density as a way of reducing people's carbon footprints, and a pro-growth business community that sort of said, hey, Minneapolis can be a kind of status quo, medium-sized city in America and increasingly lose out to superstar cities, or we can be a pro-growth city and be a place that people want to move to and that creates opportunity in a more broad way. And they were able to build this unusual coalition and able to get the city to engage in a kind of broad zoning reform that to me speaks to possibility. Again, a small one and certainly insufficient to the task at hand, but at least some sense of what's possible given how stuck our politics seem.
Thank you, Omar. Did you?
Just one further point on that is the notion that we could have, for example, a business coalition partner at the table is no longer all that politically viable in a bunch of circles, because we don't have a shared vision of upward mobility as something that should be pursued. Aren't we over our holding capacity already? Once you inject that kind of degrowth concept, and there's a climate scenario that's all about degrowth, as contrasted with growth, prosperity, technology, another climate scenario. But once you start down the road of degrowth, then, you know, San Francisco can charge $165,000 in fees per apartment, which is more than it costs or did to join Mar-a-Lago. We can charge what amounts to an entry fee that is completely racially and otherwise exclusionary, and just sort of justify it because, you know, we're kind of holier than thou enviros. And, you know, so many of my civil rights friends, and I say civil rights, not EJ, because it's a broader agenda, are like, the Democratic Party has again abandoned us because all they listen to is labor and enviros. And that's not true, because the environmental justice community has earned a very well-earned seat at the table, but it was a partial seat for a broader civil rights agenda. And that's been lost. And we just have to reclaim that. Otherwise, we really are saying it is okay for Sausalito to intentionally racially segregate. It is okay for San Francisco to charge more than Donald Trump's country club, to have a place to rent in that city. By the way, that very project was later sued under the California Environmental Quality Act by the owners of a Russian nudist bath club who occupied a roof that would be visible from some of those apartments, and they thought their patrons shouldn't have to put up with the shade cast by that apartment building. That's what we've defined the environment as: protection from shade for nude bathers. Why is it the rest of the country lets California get away with this crap? I don't know. But the idea that our ethic is being exported to Washington is terrifying, unless you're already white and wealthy.
One very quick point on that is also that this scrambles our politics in, I think, a really interesting way, right? It's not quite left-right. It's a lot of people in Princeton, in Berkeley, who are deeply liberal, who are engaging in deeply conservative status quo maintaining politics. It's also people who are very conservative, engaging in maintaining status quo politics, and then an odd assortment of outsiders trying to push for change who might be libertarian and racial justice advocates on the left. And so it's I think there's an interesting possibility in that scramble of new possible coalitions for change.
Thea's giving me a look. Yep, that sounds great. Are you going to be asking from online, or do we want to go to the audience?
We're going to go to the audience. We're going to
Okay.
ask folks to introduce themselves before you ask your question. So if anyone has a question, raise your hands. Questions?
This has been a really fascinating, interesting conversation. I'm Josh Fried. I'm the Senior Vice President for Climate at Third Way. I wanted to explore the cost issue around transportation and the idea that the cost of housing sort of necessitates a less expensive option in the exurbs potentially. And we've seen, I just took a couple notes on this, that like the cost of transportation for people is the second highest expense when they move. And the susceptibility to fluctuation like oil prices is extremely expensive. HUD found that in 2008, that was an enormous impact on lower income families who lived outside cities. I mean, cost of commute, et cetera, and that it's a sunk cost that depreciates immediately, and that the farther out you live, the more you have to end up spending on transportation to and from your job, particularly to your point, if your work is actually place-based and you have to go there. And so how do you wrestle with that as well in terms of factoring in the cost of living in a city, and as you pointed out, that there are escalating costs there as well, and like the living in the exurbs is not necessarily a solution given the transportation costs involved as well. And so I'm curious, sort of, how do we deal with that? And it may be more of a California issue than in some other places where the hurdles to development aren't as high as Omar was pointing out with Minneapolis.
So first off, there's a ton of housing opportunity in suburbs, existing suburbs. So we're not talking always about exurbs. Second, in California, to the extent any exurban development is happening, it's on a mixed-use platform. So there's employment, there's retail, there's medical, and there's homes and schools and whatever. So we don't have the mile after mile of Levittown model, and haven't for decades. But to your main point, which is, gosh, isn't owning and maintaining a car super expensive? Isn't it cheaper to live in the house, in the city? If it's a $1,500 a month rent nut, or a $5,000 a month rent nut, if you can find a place to live at all, which you probably can't, and God help you if you have a credit issue or any kind of brush with the criminal justice system or anything else, because then even if you could afford $5,000 a month, you're going to be passed over for someone that doesn't have that background. There's just no place to afford to live. So when the housing market is this broken, is this foundationally broken, a $3,000 Honda, plus, which is pretty fuel efficient, plus some gas, and the lowest possible level of required insurance, is a hugely less expensive trade than jumping on BART, which is what, about $16 a day, probably from the Stockton area, or more, when you combine 2 train trips and a bus trip. So, that's actually a big nut. Transit has so much promise, but fixed route, hardcore infrastructure transit, we have about a 20-year delivery schedule on. We have the highest by far, except in New York City, cost per mile to build. So you're going to wait 20 years for your kid to have a train? Or are you going to have an inexpensive Honda and a place to live? Because otherwise, and we see this all the time, especially pre-COVID, folks coming in 2.5, 3 hours per one way. They're called supercommuters. We have the most of them in the country. Mm-hmm. You would see in nice neighborhoods, reasonably nice cars, dark tinted windows, a laundered shirt hanging in the window, and on a Tuesday night it's fogged in because someone coming in from Stockton is sleeping in their car overnight. They're hot bunking. They're literally changing out the same bed with someone else on shift work in a 16-occupant, 2-bedroom apartment with 2 bunk beds. I mean, that's an LA story. NRDC tried to make this claim years ago that, oh, cost of housing or cost of transportation, once it's, taken into account, it's better to take transit. And the numbers are just nonsense.
There's one detail that I think is interesting to kind of thread some of this together. It's not directly responsive, but it sort of fascinated me. There was a study, I'm forgetting who it was, but like someone like McKinsey looked at productivity across a bunch of industries. And in something like 20 industries over the last century, there have been substantial improvements, like the capacity to make something per dollar's gone up, gone down by about 80%. The one industry in the United States that had seen no productivity improvements over most of the last century was construction. And if you think about housing and transportation and things like nuclear power, which are essentially like very large construction projects, like one of the puzzles where I think there is a question that's not just about the state, though the state is an important actor, is like why over decades have we not been able to get more efficient at building homes, at building infrastructure, right? We have some of the worst numbers in the world for a mile of subway. And I think that is like a really big puzzle that remains to me. I've never seen a really good explanation for like why we've gotten worse at that in many ways over the last century.
Let's take a couple more questions. I think we may be getting a little tight on time, so maybe if there's multiple questions, we'll take a couple at a time and then go back to the panel. Questions?
Thanks, everyone. This has been fascinating. Zeke Housefather from Breakthrough here. So it seems like an area where there's increased agreement between many different sides of the environmental community today is that we do need to get better at building things, be it houses, nuclear reactors, clean energy projects, transmission, public transit, whatever. A lot of what seems to be holding it up today is not both our regulatory environment, but also our litigation environment. The fact that so many of our environmental laws are enforced via litigation that can hold up projects for 10, 20 years. And so my question to you is, how do we solve that? Like, how do we change the laws? What laws do we change? How do we build a coalition to do that, to move it so we can, have any chance of accomplishing our equity and our climate goals in the types of timeframes that are relevant to people?
So until 1984, it was legal to build housing as
Hey,
long
Jennifer,
as...
let's just take a couple. I'm going to take one or two more questions, get a set of questions up there, just so that we can bring more people into the conversation, and then have you guys deal with them all, sort of however you want to.
Hi, my name is Charles Mann, and it sounded to me, I wasn't quite sure, like you guys are disagreeing about something, and I wanted to find out if that's clear. It sounded to me like you were saying that the kind of plans for densification, high-rise construction, and so forth, lead to much more expensive buildings that have inherent problems with race and class. And it sounded like you were saying that this is an absolutely necessary thing to do. So is that a disagreement? And could you possibly talk about that if that's the case?
Let's take one more question.
Hi, I'm Michael Burnham Fink. I'm a San Francisco renter. And the missing part in this story about transportation, transportation, housing, and energy is jobs. Why have we decided that all the jobs have to be in a handful of major urban cores that are hours away from everywhere, given that shockingly few of these jobs are dependent on heavy capital, such as your classic US steel plants? Why don't we move the jobs to the people instead of the people to the jobs?
Okay, let's go back to the panel now.
So I'll do my little piece first. On jobs to the people, much like the monopoly that taxi medallions had on cities, we had a breakthrough. And we now have enough technology and have, with COVID, a demonstrated track record on the success of keyboard economy jobs moving to other places. I don't see that reversing. And so we have had a mass exodus, including to suburbs and exurbs, and frankly, pretty wild areas, true kind of mountain resort areas. Tahoe's on fire in terms of housing crisis. So I think we've pushed past some of the job story to the issue of whether we have a disagreement. The answer really is an and. Of course we need more housing in Silicon Valley, right up and down San Pablo. It's our main, that's the East Bay version. What's the, El Camino is kind of an artery in Silicon Valley. And of course we should be repurposing any number of kind of silly land uses to create higher density. And for the people who are earning $150,000 a year and are fine living in a small kind of post-dorm environment before they decide to have kids, fantastic. You know, you want to spend that kind of money on rent? Go for it. And if that's a price of being in that industry, go for it. But it's an and, because housing isn't just about that, nor is it just about taking the poorest slice and creating affordable housing units that union-led households will never qualify for because they earn too much money, but not enough to live. We've completely blown up the middle. And that's where people are, not so much special interests, but people. And California has betrayed its people. We have more than 40% of people in California who can't make monthly expenses, even including public benefits. United Way of California did that study. PPIC confirmed it. I mean, that's a broken society. And then, you know, you try to get your kids back to school and there's no after-school program. Well, no kidding. Who's going to live making after-school wages in this kind of housing market? So we have to fix the middle. And it's an all-of-the-above strategy for housing, not an either-or.
So I think I might also agree with that and add maybe one or 2 points, right? So one is there are a bunch of ways in which we regulate housing to be more expensive in something like an apartment building, right? So something like parking minimums can add hundreds of thousands of dollars to, you know, I'm forgetting the exact number, but I think it's something like $50,000 per parking spot is the construction cost, right? So in the apartment building in Glendale, California that I live in now, right, I get 2 parking spots with the apartment, but of course I would rather not be paying for one that I don't use, but that's by law, they have to do 2 parking spots for my apartment, right? So that shows up in my rent, but you could potentially have it as less. There are other things. Much of the country, there are laws to protect consumers that are, you can't have an apartment less than a certain minimum footprint. Turns out, like, there are a lot of people who already solve that problem by putting, you know, 4 or 5 people in an apartment and putting up walls in the living room, but it's illegal to have an apartment that's 200, you know, what's called a micro unit, 250 to 400 square feet. Those can be economical for developers. In fact, they're more economical than, you know, a 2-bedroom. So if you have a micro unit and not parking, that brings down the cost of that construction significantly. But I want to concede a core point, which is that, like, there is this still fundamental problem in the country, which is it is way too expensive and too costly to build. Some of that is the time it takes to build. Some of that is the permitting process, right? So there are again examples in places like Tokyo where there's a lot of construction, housing is relatively affordable, there's high density. So it's not that it is, you know, we're trying to break some law of physics, right? Like, it is possible to have high density cities where there's affordable housing, and we can, you know, I think there are models to learn from. But I don't dispute the core math that was laid out, which is, yeah, having a bunch of bungalows on a lot is going to be cheaper than building up, because it's just much more involved construction, right? So the part of how you have to compensate for that is things like higher density in the apartment building potentially. And then on the last question, I want to kind of step back. We've been very California focused, which I think is sort of, you know, okay given where we are. But I think one of the challenges on this idea of why don't we take the jobs to the people is a deeper global pattern, which was we see a kind of emergence of superstar cities in lots of places, right? And that matters, when I was in Princeton, if you go through Trenton, New Jersey, which was the former capital and manufacturing hub, right? It has a sign that says, Trenton makes on a bridge, the world takes, right? And it's kind of a really sad commentary now because it's a down on its luck city. And you go through there are just vast swaths of America that are post-industrial places without real economic engines. And I think it's nice to think that we're going to somehow reverse that process of superstar cities capturing more of the growth and the wealth, but I don't think that's the long-term trend. And so I think that poses a really difficult problem for whether you're talking about Brexit or you're talking about any number of other policies. What do you do for the parts of within a country or across the world that are kind of left behind in that, so centrifugal is pulling out, centripetal is pulling in. The centripetal process where New York and San Francisco and other places are capturing way disproportionate share of the economic growth. And to be clear, I don't see Democrats engaging with what to do for Trenton. I don't see Republicans having anything credible there. And again, it's not just within the U.S. That's a pattern that's playing out globally. And so yes, we can at the edges, sort of shift some jobs to remote. But I think fundamentally there are these returns to density, right? And one very small example of that, right? A friend of mine who works in biotech was trying to recruit somebody to his firm in the Bay Area, and she's like, well, what if I move and your company goes out of business? And he says, if my company goes out of business, you walk across the parking lot and there are 3 more biotechs there, right? Like you don't have to worry about my firm because there's this whole ecosystem, right? And so you've got a set of mutually reinforcing processes that are going to be centralizing, and that works very much against the possibility of decentralizing some of that growth. And I think that's a deep, broad global trend.
Okay, I wish this conversation could go on. Do you have any final thoughts, Julian?
Yeah, so I actually started my career in housing policy, so I've been pretty quiet about the housing stuff because it's really interesting to get back in the headspace of it. And I guess I just wanted to close with 2 reflections on that experience. It was in New York City, so different context. And the 2 reflections are that the politics are kind of stupid and the systems are kind of stupid. So the politics are kind of stupid. Here's the sort of anecdote of that. When I was working for the Department of Housing Preservation Development, we did the first project to legalize basement units. And we did it in probably one of the dumbest places to do it in the city, which was East New York. And we did it there because there was a city councilman who wanted us to look into basement apartments in East New York to try to figure out how to legalize them. And the very basic point here is that the policymaking systems have to respond to politicians who don't look at the whole field logically, right? And we knew almost immediately after looking at these units and looking in the basements where it was simply just too small to legalize the units, that the right place to look was Queens. And yet we went through with a project about legalizing basement units in East New York. So the politics is just kind of dumb sometimes. The second point is, and this one I thought was also very fascinating, we had this conundrum where consistently the people who were accessing affordable units in the city of New York were not the folks who were the most in need of the sort of band of area median income. And we were very confused as to why this was the case. Why was it always consistently skewing towards people with more education, a little bit more income, et cetera? And it turned out that a probably significant portion of the reason was that the website where you input all your information to show that you qualified for these units was incredibly stupidly and poorly designed. And all of these people were going and putting, $30K or whatever when they were inputting their yearly income and disqualifying themselves on the spot because the thing was so finicky that if you put it in the wrong way, you immediately were sorted out of the pile. And so I think that there's probably, my point here is that there's a lot of sort of heady questions. There's also a lot of stupid ones that we need to figure out. And I think that like those ones feel like ones where we could actually figure it out. Like, don't build the basement apartments in a place where the basements aren't tall enough, and figure out like an application system that's like workable by normal humans like me, who already lost his, you know, breakthrough dialogue, like dangly placard, right? Like I would have screwed up on that thing. And if I'm going to screw up, I'm sure there's tons of others who would.
I think we're up. Time is up. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for sharing your time and insights. And if I just could say something really quick to close, you know, I know that this term decoupling is something that we use a lot in association with breakthrough, and maybe I just don't understand the term well enough, which I should after 10 years. But all these issues that we've been talking about today in terms of environmental justice, housing, affordability, transportation, it doesn't seem like decoupling is really a solution. They all seem pretty deeply coupled, and to keep wrestling with the tensions, the lower hanging fruit, like, you know, Julian kept bringing up, as well as just some of these fundamental problem areas, I think is, you know, perhaps better and more accurate terminology moving forward. That's it.
So